Okay, so Assalamu alaikum everybody. Welcome all to today's session. It's going to be about skepticism and tolerance, a case from pre-modern Arabic-Islamic thought. And the talk will be given by Dr. Ayman Shihadeh, whom most of us know. He is a senior humanities research fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi, and he is a reader in Arabic intellectual history at SOAS. After studying at the universities of Oxford and London, he worked at the University of Edinburgh before joining SOAS in 2008. He specializes in the history of philosophy and theology in the Islamic world and has published 7 books on the subject, including the Theological Ethics of Fakhruddin al-Razi, and recently translated also into Arabic, as well as Doubts on Avicenna and Philosophical Theology in Islam, which is just the most recent book. Occupying key roles of academic leadership, he currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of SOAS, published by the Cambridge University Press, which is a leading journal on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, published ever since 1917. And he is also the editor of Philosophy and Theology on the Encyclopedia of Islam, published by Brill, and also as the editor of Islamic translation series with Brill as well. So until recently, he was the chair of the British Association for Islamic Studies, BRACE, and the chair of the Brace de Gruyter Prize in the Study of Islam and the Muslim World. So without further ado, Dr. Ayman, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah, and I also want to thank Khalifa University for inviting me to give this talk, which is a real honor. I was meant to deliver this talk in person on campus earlier this year, but then the virus struck. But on the plus side, this way we can hopefully reach an even wider audience. Okay, so it's well established nowadays that moderate skepticism can be conducive to the toleration of views contrary to one's own. But what do I mean by skepticism here? By skepticism, I refer not out directed at one or more particular views, as the expression is often used these days, as for instance, when you describe someone as being skeptical about climate change, for instance, meaning that he rejects this notion, or at least has serious doubts about it, and most probably champions a contrary view that the climate is not changing. I rather refer to a general position of doubt towards the possibility of knowledge in one or more areas of knowledge. If this epistemological attitude involves the complete denial of the possibility of knowledge, it's often termed global skepticism. But many types of skepticism are restricted to specific fields of knowledge. There are discussions of some rather extreme expressions of this sort of skepticism in pre-modern Islamic sources, although the majority are based on reports of ancient skepticism. We're told that some skeptics deny that any real knowledge could be gained through the senses, or through reasoning, or through either. So, for instance, Buddhists, referred to in the pre-modern sources as the Sumaniya, are portrayed as advocating a skeptical stance which admits only of sensory knowledge and denies the efficacy of rational reflection, or thinking, another, as a means of gaining any scientific knowledge, including theological knowledge. And Islamic theology, of course, was widely viewed as a science, ilm. And by the way, this is not an accurate portrayal of Buddhism, of course, far from it, but that's a different story. It's helpful to think of this sort of extreme skepticism as comprising 2 central views, one descriptive, the other prescriptive. The 2 components, the is and the ought, are logically independent of each other, as the descriptive thesis is not sufficient to justify the prescription. The descriptive thesis, simply put, is that our beliefs are not justified and hence do not constitute knowledge. The prescriptive thesis is that we therefore ought to suspend judgment, tawaqquf, on those beliefs. But there are also moderate strands of skepticism, which is what I'm interested in today. moderate strands. These two can be expressed in a descriptive thesis and a prescriptive one. Some instances of skepticism, for instance, are restricted to specific areas of knowledge, and moreover admit that often beliefs are better justified than contrary beliefs. So one need not suspend judgment in these cases, but may accept a better justified belief as a possible or a probable belief. We would not normally call this moderate position skepticism nowadays, because the bar is set much lower these days for what counts as knowledge, because we don't normally expect a belief to be absolutely 100% certain and irrefutable to deem it has been justified enough to be counted as knowledge. But by the standards of pre-modern Islamic theology, and in fact the vast majority of medieval philosophers, this was definitely considered a skeptical position. And this is very significant, because to assess the extent to which a view is conventional or radical, we should do so by the standards, primarily by the standards of its original setting. Now, the relation between this moderate skepticism and tolerance is that if I'm able to entertain some doubts about my own views, if I acknowledge that they are uncertain and hence fallible, I should, to an extent, assume a tolerant attitude towards contrary views held by others. In medieval Islamic thought, the link between doubt and tolerance is a familiar feature of the discipline of law, in which it's widely acknowledged that differences of opinion often boil down to the inconclusiveness of the evidence and the amenability of the evidence to alternative interpretations, and accordingly that a degree of tolerance ought to be shown to exponents of contrary views. Again, we wouldn't call this doubt skepticism, of course, because it's the norm in Islamic jurisprudence. We speak of skepticism only in contexts wherein doubt is not the norm. Expressions of doubt, however, are hard to come by in systematic theology, kalam or usul al-din. A theologian needed to arrive at knowledge in the core areas of theology, and knowledge had to be certain. A clear-cut distinction was made in theology between knowledge and other types of belief, to the extent that in classical Ash'arism, the two, and Ash'arism is a major school of theology, by the way, so in classical Ash'arism, the two, knowledge and belief, are essentially distinct, like black and white. You can have an unjustified belief, and if this belief is then substantiated, it ceases to be a belief, and it is replaced with something altogether, knowledge. If you can entertain any doubt in a given belief, then it is not knowledge. And if I have some doubt about a belief that I hold, then it's conjecture, dhann. Or I could have serious doubt, shak, about a belief. So I'm unable to decide between that belief and a contrary belief. Or maybe I hold X today, but I wake up tomorrow feeling that not X is in fact true. And this is called shak, doubt. In theology, this epistemological stance is tied to the conception of religious or creedal belief, Iman. And creedal belief is another big and complicated topic, which I cannot go into here. But basically, everyone was required to have firm belief in the core doctrines of theology. According to Ash'aris, at least, this is one of the principal conditions of creedal belief. So firm belief is one of the principal conditions of creedal belief. And Ash'aris, it's not the only condition, of course. It's not the only condition, because one can know something and yet still deny it. So according to Ash'aris, assent is another condition for creedal belief. One dominant view is that unlearned believers are required to have firm belief based on uncritical imitation, taqlid, rather than proper justification through evidence. However, scholars are required to have knowledge, which is justified belief. For a scholar, therefore, to admit failure to arrive at knowledge concerning a core theological doctrine is therefore an extremely serious admission, because it could undermine his status as a believer. Which is why you don't hear of theologians in the classical period expressing doubts concerning the core doctrines of theology. The debate on whether the world is eternal or whether it has a temporal beginning and was created ex nihilo, out of nothing, is a case in point. Medieval Muslim theologians, without exception, advocated the doctrine that the world is created ex nihilo, which is to say, out of nothing. Whereas most philosophers of the Neoplatonized Aristotelian tradition, most notably Avicenna or Messina, maintain that the world is eternal and that it has been created by God, the first cause, as philosophers call it, continuously and from pre-eternity, and will continue to exist forever. But just to be clear, not all philosophers were eternalists. Some championed alternative cosmogonies, including creation ex nihilo. Cosmogony, by the way, is a theory about the genesis of the world. By the 10th and 11th century, we find numerous expressions from across the broader theological spectrum of the view that creation ex nihilo is effectively a core article of faith. It's often said to be the cosmogonic doctrine taught unambiguously, not only in the Quran, but indeed in all previous books of revelation. And the doctrine upheld not just by Muslims, but by the adherents of all revealed religions, according to theologians of this period. The sources often state that there is consensus, ijma', among Muslims, not only on this being the only true doctrine, but moreover on that those who deny it are unbelievers. The locus classicus, though not earliest expression of this position, is of course Al-Ghazali's well-known verdict, both in the Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa, and other works, that those philosophers who championed the pre-eternity of the world are unbelievers, because the doctrine is taught so unambiguously in Scripture that to deny it, one would have to admit that revelation contains untruths. So in support of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, theologians adduce various proofs which, in their view, provided certitude of its truth, and hence guaranteed its status as an item of knowledge. The most important is the so-called proof from accidents, on which, incidentally, I recently published an article which is freely available online. The case that I'm going to discuss in what follows is an exception. And it is really quite a remarkable one. It occurs in the later career of the famous philosophical theologian Fakhruddin al-Razi, who lived around the turn of the 13th century and was hugely influential on later philosophy and theology in the Islamic world. So that's just his name and death date. If we were to list the top 10 most important figures in the pre-modern Islamic intellectual history, which I'm not proposing as a serious exercise, because it would be a fool's errand, but if we were to do this, Razi would have to be among them, up there with Shafi'i and Avicenna. And yet, with one or two exceptions, serious study of his thoughts started only around 15 years ago. It goes to show that there is still an awful lot of research to be done, not only on him, but more broadly on pre-modern Islamic intellectual history. Anyway, Al-Razi was an Ash'ari theologian who engaged with a wide variety of philosophical and theological sources, including Avicenna, Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, who's another philosopher, different strands of Mu'tazili theology, al-Ghazali and his followers, and others. And to cut a long story short, out of this mix, he pioneered, and I would say engineered, the form of philosophical theology that became the hallmark of later Islamic intellectual history. And this is the focus of this recent publication. Al-Razi wrote both theological and philosophical works, and as his earlier theological works attest, he initially championed the traditional theological view that creation ex nihilo is the orthodox doctrine, whose certainty is guaranteed by original proofs and confirmed by scriptural evidence, and that whoever denies this doctrine is an unbeliever. But we notice a change in his position in works dating to the last 3 years or so of his career, most notably in the lengthy but unfinished work of philosophical theology titled Al-Matalib al-Aliyah fi al-Ilm al-Ilahi, which can be translated as the higher investigations in the divine sciences. And by the way, this work is only in 8 volumes. The 9th volume is actually published in this work is actually a separate work. And this change, to my mind, so yeah, we see a change in the last works dating to the last 3 years or so of his career, and this change, to my mind, is a direct outcome of a more fundamental epistemological stance. So when describing his own method of research, what he calls bahth, Al-Razi criticizes 2 groups of contemporaries whom he considers partisan and dogmatic in their approach. The first are the philosophers who, as he describes them, are only interested in defending, that's contemporary philosophers, they're only interested in defending and refining the teachings of their predecessors, most notably Avicenna, as though these teachings constituted a doctrinal orthodoxy. And he compares this attitude of theirs to that of dogmatic theologians. He says, for instance, that that those philosophers effectively consider it prohibited, haram, to disagree with Avicenna. The second group are the Theocritics of philosophy, whose sole aim was to refute the philosophers. And the people he has in mind here are contemporary followers of Al-Ghazali, most importantly Sharafuddin al-Mas'udi and Ibn Ghaylan al-Balkhi, both of you whom I studied in several recent publications. Sorry, I'm plugging my own research here. So this is a book in which I study Sharafuddin al-Mas'udi. This came out in 2016, and it is also freely available online, by the way, because it's open access. Al-Razi then describes, so he talks about these 2 groups, and then he describes his own methods of investigation, and he describes it as a more neutral and a non-partisan method. Although, of course, it would be very naive to think of any thinker of this period as actually neutral and non-partisan. This method is a thorough and exhaustive dialectical method consisting of several steps. The first step is that he formulates a philosophical or theological problem. To give a simple example, what is the order of the world? The second step involves identifying the range of possible positions on the problem in question, both logically and historically. For instance, logically, the world either is pre-eternal or came to be in time. If it came to be in time, then it either came to be out of nothing or it was preceded by something, and so forth. Many of those logical positions had historical representatives who adduced arguments for and against the different positions. Those arguments are are summarized, are surveyed and summarized by Razi. And in the third step, Razi himself then advances further arguments for each position and arguments against each position. And in this way, he evaluates each position through a robust process of systematic elimination and corroboration. The process is completed successfully if, at its end, only one position has good arguments for it, and if all arguments against it have been addressed. Complete certainty, Razi writes, is achieved only after all objections and counter-arguments have been taken into consideration and resolved, unquote. Otherwise, as Razi himself tells us, the investigation process, if this process has yielded inconclusive results, that is, if it ends either without a decisively compelling position, or if more than one position emerges compelling, then one must suspend judgment, tawaqquf. And indeed, in his earlier works, Razi does suspend judgment on some problems. But these are not core theological doctrines, but mostly problems of physics, which are relatively minor in the larger scheme of things. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, suspending judgment is not the only possible outcome of a skeptical outlook. And in fact, this is what we encounter in Razi's later work, the aforementioned Talib, where he proposes a moderate, restricted skepticism, one that does not recommend an automatic suspension of judgment. The same stance finds expression in another later work, the epistle titled Risalat Dham Laddat Dunya, which I published in this book in 2006. Dham Laddat Dunya, censure of this worldly pleasures. Razi admits that in metaphysics, both in the Matalib and to an extent in this work as well, he admits that in metaphysics, so not in all areas of knowledge, metaphysics, it is extremely difficult and rare to succeed conclusively in proving one view and eliminating all contrary views. But rather than advocating the alternative of suspending judgment altogether, as he did in earlier works, here he says that this outcome may be averted if one is able to establish that on the weight of evidence, one view emerges as more compelling than the alternative views, and that view is therefore more probable or more apt. The words he uses, awla, are awla and akhlaq. So if one view appears or emerges as more compelling or more apt than other views, then one may be justified to affirm that view, not as an apodictic certainty, but as a probable belief. So I would describe this stance as a form of moderate skepticism, as opposed to extreme global skepticism. I would describe it as a form of skepticism for two reasons. First, because this was actually seen as skepticism back then, and in fact, Razi himself, in earlier works, he describes this position, and he considers it a type of skepticism. And second, because Razi expresses dissatisfaction, even anguish, at the realization that certainty, knowledge, is beyond reach. And he expresses this both in the Matalib and in this other shorter work I just referred to. So you can see clearly that he arrived at this moderately skeptical position reluctantly. And you really have to admire the man for his sincerity and honesty about this. This epistemological position occasions a surprising expression of tolerance. For in the same work, the Matalib, Razi includes a lengthy 400-page discussion on cosmogony, in which, unsurprisingly, he mentions the doctrine that the world is created ex nihilo. And Noor Hassan, who recently published a book on Saifuddin al-Amidi's views on creation, discusses this in a forthcoming article. However, Razi starts this part of the book with a preliminary discussion in which he lays out the various cosmogonic doctrines of earlier philosophers and theologians, both ancient and Islamic, including the ancient physician Galen. So he mentions the ancient physician's Galen's position, which is to suspend judgment on the question of the origin of the world altogether, because it lies beyond the limits of our knowledge, according to Galen. Although some, Razi notes, criticize Galen for this seeming failure to take a more positive position on this question, on this important question, he himself, Razi himself, has nothing but praise and admiration for the stance taken by his ancient predecessor. Galen's suspension of judgment is evidence, quote, that the man was an impartial seeker of truth. For the investigation of this problem, the origin of the world, that is so intractable, difficult, that most minds crumble in the pursuit, unquote. So Galen, in other words, should be excused for suspending judgment here, and in fact should be admired for his honesty. Razi then spends the next 400 pages or so investigating the various cosmogonic theories he set out here. And one would normally expect an unambiguous refutation of them all, except for the theological doctrine of creation ex nihilo. However, he is clearly not convinced that he has quite achieved this. For although he feels able to eliminate some positions effectively, such as atheistic eternalism, the view that the world is eternal, and that there is no creator in existence, and such as dualist cosmogonies, according to which the world has two creative principles. So although he feels able to eliminate some positions, not all positions are eliminated so decisively. For at the very end of his discussion on cosmogony, he concludes with the following statement, which I've translated somewhat freely here. Okay. He says, now that those positions have been set out and investigated, and that the points of strength and weakness of each are identified, those who find themselves perplexed and confounded would say, those proofs are not rigorous and decisive enough as to eliminate all doubt, prevent excuses, which I'll come back to in a moment, and with their decisiveness and lucidity, put the mind at rest. Rather, each one of those positions continues still to be tinged with confusion. One who is merciful and generous would therefore be expected to excuse those who err in such intractable problems. Okay, so there are two salient points in this important passage. The first is that Razi does not feel that he has been able to establish creation ex nihilo and to eliminate alternative models conclusively. He comes very close to admitting that he affirms the doctrine only as a probable belief, something that, as far as I'm aware, he nowhere states explicitly. The reference to those who find themselves perplexed and confounded is a curious one, and it strongly suggests that this actually describes Razi's own position to an extent. The second salient point is that on the basis of this expression of doubt, he says that those who champion some of the alternative cosmogonies treated in this work should be excused. This is first indicated by the notion that the proofs do not prevent excuses. This is in line 4 here. The idea here being that the inconclusiveness of the proofs makes it excusable for people to hold any of the range of possible views on this question. Which is why Ar-Razi then says that those who subscribe to cosmogonic views contrary to one's own ought to be excused by those who, as he puts it, are merciful and generous, Ar-Rahim Al-Kareem. The intended reference of these expressions, Ar-Rahim Al-Kareem, merciful and generous, seem to be both humans who ought to be merciful and generous, but are not always merciful and generous, and God, whose names include merciful and generous, but who, according to Ar-Razi and other Ash'aris, is not obliged to act mercifully and generously, but is nonetheless expected to do so. So what Ar-Razi is saying, therefore, in this paragraph and in the wider discussion, is that those who adhere to erroneous cosmogonies should be excused and hence tolerated. They should be excused and hence tolerated by other people, and that they are likely to be forgiven by God in the hereafter. As far as I'm aware, this degree of tolerance towards conflicting cosmogonies, towards conflicting views, theories on the genesis of the world, this is unprecedented in theological texts, as far as I'm aware. And you can compare and contrast this relatively tolerant attitude to Al-Ghazali's harsh condemnation of the philosophers as unbelievers, partly for teaching that the world is pre-eternal, and Al-Ghazali's judgment that they ought to be executed, as we saw in the paragraph I showed at the beginning. Although I must add this, the punishment rarely happened in practice. It did happen, but not too often. Razi's moderate skepticism and the tolerance he advocates on its basis in his later works did not seem to have caught on, partly because those texts had relatively limited impact in the late period. They are cited by, for instance, by Ibn Taymiyyah, the 13th to 14th century Hanbali critic of Ar-Razi. He uses them polemically to demonstrate the failure of systematic theology and philosophy. But they are cited infrequently by other authors for reasons that I need not go into here. In any case, there are likely to be other interesting instances of tolerance on the basis of doubt in later Islamic intellectual history, waiting to be uncovered in future research. Another example that I'm aware of occurs in a work by perhaps coincidentally another 13th to 14th century Hanbali, Najm al-Din al-Tufi, where he defends predeterminism, Jabr as he calls it, at great length, but concludes by admitting that the position he champions is one that can be held is not one that can be held with certainty, qat'i, but rather a probable belief, dhanni, and therefore that those who hold the contrary view that humans have free will should be excused and not condemned as unbelievers. However, the question of whether humans are predetermined or have free will was not as serious and central a problem, a theological problem, as the creation of the world. So, to conclude, I would argue that one of the factors for the intolerance that one still often encounters in contemporary Islamic thought lies in the fact that the accounts of knowledge and belief that were dominant in the medieval period are still widely prevalent today. And I will leave you with this thought and stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayman, for this wonderful talk that you have given us. Very insightful about skepticism and tolerance and Al-Razi's understanding and debates on this kind of issue. That's a very important topic, so thank you so much for your insights. And I'd like to thank everybody, all the attendees, all the people who listened, all of those who discussed for their wonderful questions and discussions. So thank you all very much, and thank you especially to Dr. Ayman. I know it's not easy to basically show our appreciation as we're all behind some screens, but I'm sure everybody is clapping for you right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you.